It was Halloween night, and our house was buzzing with excitement. My family had thrown a huge party and invited the whole neighborhood. Kids were running around in costumes, bowls of candy were scattered everywhere, and spooky decorations covered every inch of the house. My mom had outdone herself with the creepy decorations, and everyone seemed to be having a great time. I was in the kitchen, grabbing some snacks, when I noticed someone I hadn't seen before walk through the front door. They were dressed in this strange, old-fashioned costume, like something out of a really old movie. A long, dark coat, a high-collared shirt, and a hat that seemed too big for their head. I figured they were just another guest who had gotten creative with their costume, so I didn't think much of it. The party went on, but every time I saw the strange guest, I felt uneasy. Something about them didn't feel right. They moved quietly through the crowd, not really talking to anyone, but always watching. At one point, I saw them standing by the old family photos my mom had hung up in the living room. They were staring at one photo in particular, a picture of my great-grandparents from way back in the day. After a while, my mom noticed them too. She walked over and introduced herself, as she always did with new faces. The guest smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was strange, like they knew something we didn't. Then they said something that made my mom's face go pale. "I'm a distant relative," the guest said, "from the old days. I've come to see the family." My mom looked confused but tried to stay polite. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't remember hearing about you." The guest just nodded and said, "That's because it's been a long time. I haven't been around in a while." As the night went on, things started to get weirder. My dad, who had been joking and laughing all night, suddenly complained of feeling lightheaded. My little brother, who never got scared of anything, refused to go near the guest and hid behind me whenever they were in the same room. Even our dog, Max, kept growling whenever the guest walked by. And then the guest started talking to my mom again. This time they were saying things about our family that no one could possibly know. Old stories about my great-grandparents, details about how they lived, even the exact day they got married. My mom was getting more and more uncomfortable, and I could see it in her eyes. She had no idea who this person was, and she was scared. I overheard the guest talking about a tragedy that had happened many years ago. It was Halloween night, they said, their voice calm and steady. A terrible accident. One of the family members died, a cousin, a long time ago. My mom's face went completely white. I didn't know anything about this, but I could tell from her expression that this story was real. But how could this stranger know? At this point, the mood of the party had changed. People were starting to leave, and my dad looked worse by the minute. He was pale and sweating, like he was coming down with something. I tried to shake off the bad feeling in my gut, but it wouldn't go away. There was something wrong about all of this. Finally, my mom had enough. She pulled the guest aside and asked them straight up, "Who are you? How do you know all of this about my family?" The guest just stared at her for a moment, then smiled that same eerie smile again. "I told you," they said softly. "I'm family. I've been waiting a long time to come back." My heart started racing. I didn't know what they meant by that, but it sounded wrong, really wrong. "Waiting?" my mom asked, her voice shaking. The guest nodded. "I died on Halloween night many years ago. It was an accident, an unfortunate event. But now I'm back, and I've come to take someone with me." My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The guest wasn't alive. They were a ghost. A long-dead relative who had come back to take one of us with them. I wanted to run, to get out of the house as fast as I could, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. My mom was frozen too, staring at the guest in horror. Suddenly, my dad collapsed. He hit the floor hard and my mom screamed. I rushed over to him, shaking him, trying to get him to wake up, but he was barely conscious, his breathing shallow. The guest just stood there watching. My mom called 911, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. The ambulance came quickly, and they rushed my dad to the hospital. Thankfully, he made it, but the doctors couldn't figure out what had caused him to collapse. After that night, we never saw the strange guest again. My mom tried to find out who they were, but no one in our neighborhood had ever heard of them or seen them before. It was like they had vanished into thin air. But one thing was clear. Whoever or whatever that guest was, they weren't just a regular partygoer. We avoid talking about that Halloween night. It's too unsettling, too terrifying to think about what might have happened if we hadn't confronted the guest when we did. All I know is that Halloween will never feel the same again. And if you ever throw a party and a strange guest shows up uninvited, maybe think twice before letting them in. You never know who or what they really are. It all started with a dare. My friends and I were bored, sitting around one Friday night with nothing to do. Someone, probably Matt, mentioned the old abandoned house on Elm Street. Everyone knew about it. The place had been empty for decades, and people whispered stories about a little girl who disappeared on Halloween night years ago. They said her ghost still haunted the house, waiting for someone to play with. "Let's go check it out," Matt suggested, his voice full of excitement. He was always the first to suggest something reckless. At first, I didn't want to go. It sounded dumb. Haunted houses weren't real, right? But everyone else was into it, and I didn't want to be the only one who chickened out. So, we grabbed some flashlights and set off toward Elm Street. The house looked even creepier in person. The windows were cracked, the paint peeling off the walls, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. It was dark, too. So dark, it felt like the shadows were moving, even though nothing else was. We all stood in front of the house for a moment, staring up at it. "Well, are we going in or what?" Matt asked, already walking up the porch steps. The door creaked open when he pushed it, like in one of those horror movies. The inside was even worse than the outside. The air was musty, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. Dust covered everything, and old broken furniture was scattered around the living room. "Spooky," Jayla whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. We split up, our flashlights sweeping over the decaying walls. There was a staircase leading up to the second floor, and I could see a hallway stretching into darkness. The house felt wrong. It was too quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, I heard it. A faint giggle. I froze, my heart racing. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, turning to look at the others. Matt and Jayla were by the staircase, and they looked just as freaked out as I felt. "What was that?" Matt asked, his voice a little shaky. Another giggle. This time it came from upstairs. "Probably just the wind," Jayla said, though she didn't sound too sure. But we all knew better. Wind didn't laugh. We climbed the stairs slowly, the wooden steps creaking beneath us. The hallway at the top stretched out in front of us, doors lining each side. My flashlight flickered for a moment before steadying, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Let's check the rooms," Matt said, trying to sound brave. We opened the first door on the right. It was a bedroom, but it was trashed, furniture overturned, papers scattered on the floor. As I shined my light around the room, I saw something on the wall. It was a drawing. A little girl had drawn it in crayon. Stick figures, a sun, and a house that looked a lot like this one. There was a name written underneath the picture. Molly. "That's the girl's name," Jayla whispered. "The one who disappeared." Another giggle, louder this time, coming from behind us. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but no one was there. "This isn't funny," Matt said, sounding more scared now. Suddenly, a door at the end of the hallway slammed shut on its own. We all jumped, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking. "We should leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But when we turned to head back downstairs, we realized something horrible. The front door, the door we had come through, was gone. It was like the house had sealed us in. The walls looked different now, almost like they were closing in on us. Panic set in. "What's happening?" Jayla cried, backing up against the wall. "We have to find another way out," Matt said, grabbing my arm. "Come on!" We raced through the house, trying door after door, but they were all locked. The giggles were growing louder now, echoing through the house like the little girl was playing a game with us. Hide and seek. Except we weren't hiding. We were trapped. Then I saw her. A small figure standing at the top of the stairs, just barely visible in the dim light. It was a little girl, her hair hanging down in front of her face. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, covered in dirt. "Molly?" I whispered, even though I knew it couldn't be. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at us with eyes that seemed too dark, too empty. Then, she smiled. A smile that sent chills down my spine. "We need to leave," I said, pulling Matt and Jayla with me. "Now!" We ran toward the back of the house, hoping to find a window we could break, anything to get out. But as we reached the kitchen, the little girl appeared again, this time closer, her giggles turning into something more menacing. Matt grabbed a chair and smashed it against the window, but it didn't break. Nothing in the house made sense anymore. It was like we were stuck in some kind of nightmare. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the walls seemed to ripple, like the house was alive. The giggles grew louder, and I realized then, we weren't just being watched. We were being hunted. "Molly doesn't want us to leave," Jayla whispered, her face pale, but we didn't stop. We ran from room to room, trying to escape the twisted game. Every time we thought we were close, the house would shift, trapping us further inside. Finally, we made it to the basement. There was a small window, and Matt managed to break it open. One by one, we crawled through, the sound of Molly's laughter following us until we were out in the night air. When we looked back at the house, the front door was there again, as if nothing had happened. But we knew the truth. That house wasn't just abandoned, it was waiting. And we'd been lucky to escape. We had just moved into our new house a week before Halloween. My wife, 2 kids, and I were excited about living in this quiet neighborhood. The houses were all decorated with spooky skeletons, jack-o'-lanterns, and fake spider webs. It felt like the perfect place to start fresh. As Halloween approached, we went all out decorating our front yard. We had ghosts hanging from the trees, a fog machine, and a huge bowl of candy ready for the trick-or-treaters. Our kids, Danny and Lucy, couldn't wait to put on their costumes and join in the fun. I was looking forward to handing out candy and meeting the neighbors. The evening started like any other Halloween. Kids dressed as superheroes, witches, and monsters came by, laughing and showing off their costumes. Everything was going great until a group of children showed up at the door. There were 4 of them, and they were dressed in old-fashioned costumes. One boy wore suspenders with a newsboy cap, and the others were dressed as a clown, a pirate, and a princess. They didn't say a word. They just held out their pillowcases, waiting for candy. I gave each of them a handful, expecting them to say, "Thank you," or something. But they didn't. They just turned and walked away without a sound. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe they were shy. About half an hour later, the same group came back. This time, their costumes looked different. The colors were faded, and the clothes were dirtier. Again, they didn't say anything, just held out their pillowcases. My wife gave them more candy, but she whispered to me, "Didn't they already come by?" I nodded, feeling a bit uneasy. But hey, it was Halloween, and kids often come back for more candy, right? So, we didn't think much of it. As the night went on, more kids showed up, but that group of 4 kept coming back. Each time they looked worse. Their clothes were ripped, and their faces were pale and dirty. Their eyes looked dull, like they weren't really there. By the 3rd time, I was starting to get freaked out. "Why do they keep coming back?" my wife asked, her voice shaking a little. "And why are they getting more and more creepy?" I didn't know what to say. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I decided that if they came back again, I'd confront them. Sure enough, about an hour later, they showed up again. This time they looked even worse. Their skin was pale, almost gray, and their clothes were practically falling apart. One of the boys had a tear in his shirt, and I swear I saw dirt on his chest, like he'd been buried underground. I stepped outside and tried to keep my voice calm. "Hey kids, haven't you been here already? What's going on?" They didn't answer. They just stood there staring at me with those empty eyes. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I wasn't sure why. It was just a bunch of kids, right? "Where are your parents?" I asked, trying to sound more firm. One of them, the boy in the newsboy cap, finally spoke. His voice was soft and distant. "We can't find them." That's when it hit me. There was something seriously wrong with these kids. I stepped back, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. My wife stood next to me, clutching Lucy and Danny, her face pale with fear. "Go home," I said, my voice trembling. "It's time for you to go home." But they didn't move. They just stood there, staring at us. I didn't know what else to do, so I slammed the door shut and locked it. We watched through the window as the kids slowly walked away down the street. My heart was racing, and I felt sick to my stomach. "What is happening?" my wife whispered, holding the kids close. I didn't have an answer. I wanted to believe it was just some creepy Halloween prank, but deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. Later that night, after we had put the kids to bed, I couldn't stop thinking about those 4 children. I did some research online, trying to find out anything I could about these kids. That's when I stumbled upon an old newspaper article. It was about a tragic accident that happened in our neighborhood on Halloween night decades ago. 4 children had been hit by a car while trick-or-treating. They were dressed in costumes that sounded eerily familiar: newsboy, clown, pirate, and princess. My stomach dropped. Those kids, they weren't just trick-or-treaters. They had died that night, and somehow they were still coming back every Halloween, reliving the night they lost their lives. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept checking the windows, kind of expecting to see those kids standing outside again, waiting for more candy. But they never came back. The next morning, I told my wife what I had found. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was just as freaked out as I was. We didn't talk about it again, and every Halloween since then, we've left the house, just in case those ghostly children decide to come back. So, if you ever see a group of kids in old worn-out costumes and they keep coming back, maybe it's time to stop handing out candy, because they might not be from this world. Thanks for watching. Don't miss out on more spine-chilling tales. Subscribe now for weekly scares. Hit that red button and join our journey into the unknown.